David, Penny Wong is always very cautious in her approach. What do you think lies behind her decision to flag formal recognition of Palestine at this particular point of time?
Laura, this isn't a sudden thought bubble. This has clearly been something the government's been considering, been looking at, been talking to allies and regional neighbours about for quite some time, as I'm told. Yes, this has to be seen in the context of what happened last week, the Israeli airstrike on the aid convoy that killed Australian aid worker Zomi Frankham, amongst others. That we saw really exploded the anger of the Albanese government towards Israel, and it really remains an unresolved point of tension when it comes to Australia trying to get more answers out of Israel. But I think that was really symbolic of what has been the growing strains in this Australia-Israel relationship. And as I say, Australia's been looking at this question of recognising Palestinian statehood for some time. No decision's been taken yet to do it, but what you saw from Penny Wong last night and the remarks just now from the Treasurer, the Prime Minister earlier today, really is a considered nudging forward of Australia's position, putting that additional pressure on Israel.
So they're obviously pressuring Israel, as you say, but when the opposition is taking such a clearly pro-Israeli position on this conflict, Penny Wong's also trying to influence the domestic debate, isn't she? I mean, how much work does the government have to do explaining the difference between Hamas and Palestine on the one hand and Israel and the Netanyahu government on the other to the Australian public?
Well, I think this is critical, Laura. You're absolutely right. This is really important for the Australian government, just to take each of those. The difference between Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, Penny Wong's argument last night in this speech was really that this sort of recognition, if it does create a pathway to a two-state solution and lasting peace, is really critical for Israel. This is in Israel's interests. To have that lasting peace in the region, in the Middle East, you need to take this step, was essentially the argument. So she's trying to frame the case for this from the right, if you like. Yet we know, and the Foreign Minister knows, this is not something that Benjamin Netanyahu would cop at all. In fact, he is under enormous political strain at home. He is arguing that he's the one that can stop this sort of international recognition of Palestinian statehood. So they're two very different things. And the other difference you point to between Hamas and the Palestinian people, well, Penny Wong is laying down a couple of preconditions before Australia would do this. Hamas has to release all hostages. There is no future for Hamas in Gaza, she says, although she is not spelling out how she thinks that can or should happen. Removing Hamas from the equation, as we know, is no easy thing to do.
Well, when you've got such an exceptionally fraught and traumatic conflict, it's always difficult to raise the question about domestic politics. But I'm hearing that there has been intense pressure on the government from within the Labor Party to change its position in recent months on this issue, that party officials have been warning the government of mass desertions of Arabic and Islamic voters who felt that they didn't have a voice and that the government had been listening too much to Israel. Are you picking that up?
Yes, from some in the Labor Party, although there are others, and spoke to one today who feels a little uneasy about all of this and acknowledges there are domestic political factors at play in why the government's moving on this. But there's no denying the pressure that the government is under. I mean, Joe Biden's under similar pressure, we know, at home as well, to take a tougher line when it comes to Israel. The Greens are campaigning squarely on this in some electorates, like Wills in Melbourne, in parts of Sydney as well. So that political reality is there. This is fraught, though, for the government, because while they need to tend to that pressure from the Greens, they also have the pressure on the other side from Peter Dutton. He's just given a speech tonight, Laura, in which he's really ripped into what Penny Wong has said here as utterly illogical, ill-timed, inappropriate. It will irreparably damage our relations with Israel. He says it's the most reckless act of a foreign minister he's seen in 22 years. So that gives you a sense of how the opposition is viewing this. They are robustly supporting Israel, even in light of last week's events, and are sharply critical of where the government's heading on this.
Yes, I wonder what he really thinks. I suppose the interesting thing to me is the absolute change from a position a few months ago where the government was sort of shying away from this issue of recognition of Palestine to a pragmatic assessment now that every time the Israel lobby attacks the government over Penny Wong's comments, that's actually a pragmatic political win for them at home.
Yeah, and look, yes, there are the domestic politics, but let's keep sight to what is happening internationally. There is clearly a shift putting more pressure on Israel from its friends and allies. You hear it from Joe Biden. He wants Israel to change course. And of course, David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, it was back in February that he did what Penny Wong's now done and opened the door to this. You know, the UK has not yet done it, but he has signalled they may be willing to recognise a Palestinian state without waiting for Israel's support, without waiting for endless years of negotiation over the borders and so on. And it's that cover that David Cameron's provided that now Penny Wong has stepped into as well. Clearly there is some international momentum. I'm told that is happening, gathering momentum behind the scenes. There's going to be a vote it's expected this month at the UN Security Council on this question. Don't expect that to get through. The US still has its veto, and its public position is still that this is a matter that needs to be resolved between Israel and Palestine. But we know behind the scenes the US is searching for a grand bargain to find a solution to this crisis in Gaza. And I think Australia's shift that we've seen this week needs to be seen in that context.
David, thanks so much for talking to us tonight.
Thanks, Laura.